Plus Action YouTube webinar, The Hell That Is Haiti. And it is hell. The front page of the New York Times and the news media shows the tragic attempt by Haitian people to pull themselves across the Rio Grande River, refugees from war-torn Haiti, to seek refuge in the United States, only to be deported in racist and unbelievable numbers by the racist Biden administration. Our talk today is going to cover every aspect of Haiti, from its history to the current crisis. We were going to have Bertrand Dupont, who was the editor of Haiti Liberté, and he's unable to be with us today because of medical reasons, as is Ray Laforêt, another Haitian lifelong activist. But we're pleased and fortunate to have with us two magnificent speakers, Kim Ives and Marty Goodman. Kim Ives is a founder of the weekly newspaper Haiti Liberté, where he is a writer and editor. Haiti Liberté has its offices in Haiti and in Brooklyn, New York. He previously wrote and photographed for Haiti Progrès for 23 years. Kim has made several documentary films about Haiti, including Bitter Cane, The Coup Continues, Killing the Dream, and Resistance. He is also a founding member of the International Support Haiti Network, and formerly the Haiti Support Network, which has led numerous delegations to Haiti since 1986. He and our other speaker, Marty Goodman, are long-term Haitian solidarity activists, visited Haiti, and perhaps are among the most informed in the country. Marty Goodman, who will open our remarks today, served on the board of the Haitian Refugee Center in Miami, Florida, led by Father Gerard Jean Just. He's a member of the Miami Friends of Haiti Refugees, which organized support for the political asylum and fight against the US-backed Duvalier dictatorship. In Port-au-Prince for 1986, Marty Goodman was there for the fall of the US dictator Baby Doc as a correspondent for the then New York publication called The Guardian. He was an official observer during the 1990 election of former president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. So we will begin with Marty Goodman, who has some quite lengthy remarks. I think we'll all appreciate Marty's background and history. We had to cancel our last week's schedule Haiti seminar because Marty had a terrible fall that required hospitalization. He's well recovered. Welcome, Marty Goodman. And Marty, you're still muted.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and hello, Kim, and thank you for participating. Yeah, I had a fall last week and could not attend. You'll see the remains of that fall right there, but I'm feeling good. I'm ready to go. Okay. Watching the fall of Baby Doc Duvalier on February 7, 1986 in Port-au-Prince was the most incredible experience of my life. Perhaps 1 million ecstatic Haitians were in the street, singing, shouting, many of them waving green palm fronds that symbolize peace. For more than a year, huge crowds had mobilized to demand that Baby Doc and his cronies step down. Now it had finally happened. The US-backed Duvalier family dictatorship had terrorized Haiti for 29 years. I asked myself, how would the misery finally end as I watch Haitians celebrate Baby Doc's choreographed departure? By 3 p.m. or so, bullet shots began to crack and the streets of the capital cleared quickly. Thus began what was to be known as Duvalierism without Duvalier, courtesy of the CIA, of course. Officially, the army had given baby Doc the boot. I could see from inside the palace, where I was for an early press conference, that some Haitians were carrying signs saying, "Vive l'Armée," giving credit to the army for kicking out Duvalier. Well, it was the same class that took over from before. Kim was there too in Haiti at that time. Behind the scenes was the CIA stage managing of the same old puppets. Over the next years, I thought about Haiti's power relationships and what it might take to overcome Haiti's misery. Considering what Haiti taught me, it was the great teacher. In 2021, Haiti's old power dynamics remain. US imperialism towers over a colossal cesspool of corruption, exploitation, and brutality. Those who have fled its misery learn that its immigration policy is frankly racist. As I mentioned in my September Socialist Action article, that by March, Biden's deportation of Haitians exceeded that of Trump for fiscal 2020. And I challenge those who told us we had to stop Trump to stop a racist from getting in. Well, he got in. He was just from another capitalist party. Internalized documents admit that Haitians, quote, may face harm, end quote. And Haitians are being sent back to an unvaccinated population, coping with COVID-19, gang violence, and hunger. Racism and imperialism have gone hand in hand in Haiti and always bipartisan in the extreme. Here's an example. During his first election campaign, Bill Clinton correctly called George Bush I racist for his naval blockade around Haiti, which intercepted refugees fleeing a brutal dictatorship in the early 1990s. The policy openly flouted US and international asylum law. The dictatorship was put into place by the CIA. Then, once in power, Clinton reinforced Bush's racist Maginot Line, preventing Haiti's Black boat people from reaching South Florida and enraging racist voters of both parties. As of yesterday, well, a week ago now, I wrote this last week. As of last week, ending the suspension of deportations has happened after the August 14 earthquake. They suspended deportation after the earthquake. And dozens of immigrants, now about 1,000, have been deported back to Haiti, many of them children and infants, defying numerous congresspersons and human rights organizations calling for a halt to the deportation of Haitians and violating every asylum law in the book, both US and international. An August 30 protest letter addressed to Biden and top US officials, signed by 344 organizations, slammed Haiti policy. Quote, since February 1, 2021, the administration sent at least 37 deportation flights to Haiti, even as your officials, addressed to Biden, acknowledged internally that those being deported, quote, may face harm, end quote, on return, and the COVID-19 pandemic raged as it raged. By March, the Biden-Harris administration had removed more Haitians since taking office than during all of fiscal year 2020. You remember, Trump was the guy who called Haiti a shithole country. Many of the deportees must return to neighborhoods controlled by gangs with ongoing kidnappings, in an already unstable environment, now further overwhelmed by Saturday's calamity, referring to August 14 earthquake, end of quote. Biden's expulsions to Haiti are primarily using the Trump-era Title 42 policy, which allows immigration officials to expel foreign nationals without hearing asylum claims under the guise of COVID sanitary protections. In other words, it's the same old racist bullshit. And Haitians that were deported say they were never even checked for COVID or got tests. The Biden administration recently appealed the federal court's decision to exempt family units from Title 42. Well, we'll see what happens. The court put a hold on family deportations. But what's interesting is the Biden administration challenged that ruling, challenged the ruling against the racist deportations. And it brings you back to Obama, whose representative in court challenged the case against the United Nations for introducing cholera to Haiti during the occupation. And 10,000 people died, 10,000. And it was Obama's legal goon who defended the UN, who refused to own up to the atrocity. In any case, I see some of my statistics are old already, but 8 flights were scheduled to go to Haiti this week, then increased to 10 per week. That may have changed, maybe more now. Homeland Security's plans signal a shift to the use of pandemic-related authority for immediate expulsion without the legal right to claim asylum, which is what we were always, way back in Reagan days, we were challenging them. You can't, in the interdiction, you can't give people an asylum hearing in a boat on the water. Anyway, the warm welcome and applause given tens of thousands of Afghan refugees today is in sharp contrast to Haiti policy that has meant decades of racist deportation to US-backed dictators. I can't emphasize the continuity of this policy enough. Coast Guard ships in the Caribbean still regularly return fleeing Haitian immigrants to Haiti. This policy contrasts with those exiles that are primarily white and or anti-communist. I lived in Miami on South Beach, where a lot of the Marielitos were, and I could hear gunfire in the middle of the night, but they got the asylum, as well as all the other Cubans. Let's pause for some history on Haiti. Haiti's 1804 slave revolution against France turned the world upside down, no less so than the Russian and Cuban revolutions of the 20th century. Haiti was the true birthplace of Black Lives Matter. It welcomed any Black person that arrived at its door. It sheltered and gave weapons to the great liberator of Latin America, Simón Bolívar. Apartheid America was horrified by Haiti's example and never forgave them for it. A US trade embargo was placed on Haiti until it finally recognized it during the second year of its civil war in 1862. In 1915, the US occupied Haiti, emptied its national bank, and rewrote Haiti's constitution. Liberal icon and the guy who defeated the right-wing Republican, FDR, bragged that he wrote the Haitian Constitution. The all-time progressive of his day, imperialist, capitalist Franklin Roosevelt, and racist. The US overturned Haiti's revolutionary era law against foreign investments and imposed racist laws, even banning Haitians from parks in Port-au-Prince. Anti-imperialist heroes like Charlemagne Perrault led a guerrilla war of liberation, no less profound than Vietnam, but never talked about as much, against US occupation. Thousands of Haitians died in it, including Perrault, the first time aerial bombardment was used in the world, in history, by the way. After the Marines left in 1934, decades of support to Washington's anti-communist allies followed. That included the infamous Duvaliers, 57 to 86, who murdered tens of thousands. Ordinary people, dissidents, everybody. Haiti's first open presidential election in 1990, or what passed for one under the nose of imperialism, I was there, by the way, led to the election of liberation theology priest and self-proclaimed socialist Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who received 67% of the vote. His mild reforms, like a slight increase in the paltry minimum wage, inadequate in my view, and there was not enough mobilizing being done to support it, and other policies, enraged Washington and the CIA. The US spent $26 million trying to destabilize the elected president while secretly funding CIA assets in the Haitian military and the fascist paramilitary. These same forces overthrew Aristide in September 91 and began a butcher regime that killed at least 6,000. The criminals later admitted to the New York Times that they were in fact on the US payroll all along. Aristide narrowly escaped Haiti and finally came to the US. Washington had actually blocked him from returning to Haiti, by the way, including Obama, because they didn't want to deal with, the response of the Haitian masses to him coming back. But that included also Obama, who blocked him from coming back after the CIA coup in 2004 that overthrew Aristide. And Kim could talk a lot about that, but anyway. Long story short, with encouragement from the Democratic Party's Black Congressional Caucus and Aristide's middle-class North American supporters, Aristide agreed to US-led UN occupation in 1994 that would restore his presidency rather than lead a Haitian resistance to overthrow the dictatorship. All right, some side note there. Wait a minute. Okay, get into that later. Washington's caveat: accept the departure of top generals and freedom for coup makers, a continued imperialist occupation, and a World Bank economic agenda for Haiti based on sweatshops, austerity, and an export-driven economy. Aristide balked at some of those things, but basically had an economic program in line with the World Bank. Haiti became a template for imperialist, quote unquote, humanitarian occupations and wars. Little Haiti was used as the example because, unlike Vietnam, Haiti would not resist and they would accomplish what they wanted to. And the goals were set in stone for the future so far. At his 1994 homecoming rally in Port-au-Prince, Aristide, allaying the fears of the godfathers to the north.
Marty, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up in a minute or so.
Just a moment, folks. And those back home proclaimed to the bourgeoisie, "We are with you," end quote, as well as greeting the Haitian masses. Let me stop there to say that socialist action does not support any capitalist government, be it Democrat or Republican, here in the US or in Haiti or anywhere else in the world. Nevertheless, it should also be stated unequivocally that we stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone who opposes any form of US intervention in Haiti against Aristide or anyone else in Haiti. In 2021, the masses were in the streets, desperately poor and mostly unemployed, disgusted by an amoral system that offers no trustworthy leaders and no hope. Hundreds of thousands were demanding that dictatorial President Jovenel Moïse step down on February 7, 2021, in accordance with Haitian law. And Haitians were angry about a lot of things. There was a lot of intervention by the bourgeois politicians in these things, but you have to weigh all these factors. Anyway, Moïse remained ever buoyed by Biden's support for him in Washington. Every Haitian dictator's ace in the hole that they could count on every time. In the aftermath of the July 7th assassination of President Moïse, massive numbers of Haitians poured into the streets to protest the catastrophic inequality, poverty, and corruption in Haiti, not in grief over a despised, corrupt US puppet. What kind of guy was Moïse? Moïse had allowed most of Haiti's legislative and municipal positions to expire without holding new elections. In addition, Moïse purged several uncompliant top judges. On January 7th last year, Moïse formally announced the closure of the 50th legislature. Since then, he essentially ruled by decree. Biden's support remained unflagged by any move by Moïse. On August 17, 2020, a revealing third corruption report was revealed by Haiti's Senate. The massive report linked Moïse and others to a $2 billion embezzlement scandal. The report focused primarily on the pilfering of the, quote, Petrocaribe Fund, end quote, a Venezuelan government solidarity grant in which 40% of the revenues Haiti would owe for the sale of some $4.3 billion of Venezuelan oil from 2008 to 18, that was to be repaid at only 1% interest after 25 years. It was a huge sign of support. The funds were intended to go for projects benefiting the Haitian people, like building schools, hospitals, and so on.
Marty, I have to interrupt
assassination by as yet unknown parties.
Can you hear me, Marty?
Rogues Gallery replaced him, promising elections later this year.
Marty, please wrap it up.
Wreckage of an August 14 earthquake, a COVID crisis, tropical storms, and the epic scale of gang violence. The election promises to be another sham if it happens at all. Okay, let me just wind up with some facts about Haiti.
Marty, can you come back to that? You're 5 minutes over your time, and we have a long program ahead. So
okay.
Let's go with Kim. Kim, as I mentioned, we're proud to have you. He's a frequent guest on radio and television networks and shows, including Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, RTTV, CCTV, National Public Radio, The Hill, and on and on and on. We're proud to have you with us, Kim. I forgot to mention that I'm Jeff Mackler, the National Secretary of Socialist Action and the host of today's webinar, Socialist Action. And you can check us out, socialistaction.org. Without further ado, welcome Kim Ives.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm very pleased to be here with Socialist Action and to discuss Haiti. I'll try to be brief. There's a lot to cover. Haiti is usually not in the limelight, but since the July 7th assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, it has been in the headlines. We had the August 14th earthquake, 7.2 magnitude in the Southern Peninsula. 2 days later, August 16th, Ida, then a tropical storm, hit the Southern Peninsula as well, dumping rain, causing mudslides, and creating even more suffering for the people. About 2,200 people died at last count. That may go up, luckily, if we can say that. It happened in a rural area of Haiti and not near the urban centers, particularly Port-au-Prince, some 3 million people there. And the earthquake of 2010 caused between 60 and 80, but between 60 and 80,000 dead. So that at least was slightly lower death toll. But now we see the situation on the border in Del Rio, Texas, and this, of course, has once again thrust Haiti into the headlines. Very rapidly, I think there are three big questions that we need answers to and that people should be aware of. The first is, who killed Jovenel Moise and why? We need to understand that. That's the first question. Who is in power now and what is their agenda? And the third question is, what is the G9 and who is Jimmy Cherizier? These are the three questions I'll try to rapidly address. Who killed Jovenel and why? We have to have a little background. The governments of the PHTK, what's called the Haitian Bald-Headed Party, they came in 2010 through an election basically rigged by the US. Hillary Clinton flew down to Haiti in January of 2011, read the riot act to then President Rene Preval and said, you have to take your candidate who came in second in the election and replace him with Michel Martelly, who came in third, theoretically, and Preval agreed. Martelly went in, he won the election. It was, again, another case of the US intervening in Haitian affairs. And the PHTK was a neo-devaluerist group. Martelly had been a tonton macoute during the reign of the Duvaliers, and he brought back neoliberalism in spades. However, the principal support that fueled the government was not the US or the IMF or the World Bank. It was a thing called the Petro-Caribe Fund, to which Marty alluded. And this provided Haiti with basically $4 billion of revenue. And the Haiti only had to pay back to Venezuela 60% of its revenue. It was able to keep 40%, which amounted to about $2 billion, which went into the Petro-Caribe Fund. And the government of Michel Martelly, who came in, used that for 94%. This is the figure of their prime minister, Laurent Lamotte, 94% of their projects. Now, they also used that to help fund the election of Jovenel Moise, who was the PHTK, Michel Martelly's handpicked successor. He came into power through two elections. The first one had to be thrown out because it was so egregiously flawed. And the second one was also flawed, but it stood. And he came into power through the support that the PHTK was able to provide him through money skimmed from the Petro-Caribe Fund. Now, unfortunately for Jovenel Moise, he came into power at the same time as Donald Trump. And Trump immediately stiffened the sanctions on Venezuela and made it impossible for the Petro-Caribe Accord to continue. And so it came to a crashing halt, and suddenly the money spigot to Haiti stopped. And this meant that all of a sudden, Jovenel, who had made myriad promises in his campaigning, suddenly had no money to do it. And this resulted in a problem, a cash flow problem for him. He had to find the money somewhere. And this is where he got into a problem with Haiti's bourgeoisie, or some sectors of the bourgeoisie, who had gotten sweetheart deals from the previous president, Martelly, and Jovenel and Rene Preval. One of the deals was to a guy called Dimitri Vorb, who ran a power company, and he was getting paid a ridiculous amount of money to provide power and to the grid in Haiti. And so Jovenel came to him and said, dude, you know, I can't pay that anymore because the Petrocaribe's money stopped. You're going to have to cut me some slack. And Dmitry Vorb said, no way, and he immediately went over and started to fund the opposition. Same thing happened with a guy called Reginald Boulos, another very big bourgeois figure in Haiti. And they started to renegotiate things with him. He was borrowing money right and left. The guy's not just a Haitian capitalist. He's really a transnational capitalist. He has lots of investments in other countries even. And so now he was at odds with Vorb and Boulos, and there began a feud. It was basically, we could call it a falling out among thieves, because now the party was over. No more Petrocaribe money. The Venezuelan deal had fallen through, and they had to find the money elsewhere. So they started to fund huge demonstrations and fund the opposition to carry out giant, massive demonstrations which shut down the country. The people, of course, were hungry and ready to go out and demonstrate. And in the end, Jovenel was feuding with them, but he was doing his own counteroffensive too in the countryside. He was doing projects. He was building roads. He was putting in electricity, and he became quite popular in some parts of the countryside, in the south, in the Grand Anse, in the area of the Central Plateau, what they call, in the north and northeast, northwest. He did a lot of projects, and these also were very gave him a lot of popularity there. So there was a big struggle between this bourgeois sector and Jovenel Moïse, who was trying to hold on to power. So we at Haiti Liberté, and I think most of the Haitian people, strongly suspect that this coup, this assassination of Jovenel Moïse, which was carried out by Colombian mercenaries, who were paid king's ransom to go in and machine gun Jovenel Moïse in his bedroom in the early morning hours of July 7th, where we're pretty much sure that they're behind it. It stands to reason they had the means, they had the motive. So there was this scuffle between them, and Moïse was taking measures against Boulos, had taken measures against Vorb, and there were either maybe other Haitian bourgeois who were part of this plot, what we believe to be a plot among them. But they put these people forward, and they put a lot of straw men up, an unfortunate pastor / doctor who was penniless, another Haitian official, Joseph Felix Badiou, is on the run. He supposedly gave the order for them to kill Jovenel to the Colombians who described Jovenel over the phone to him. They didn't know who he was, apparently. And so we're dealing with the straw men, the front men at this point. We haven't gotten to the intellectual authors, to the people who paid. But what was the real motive? Was it just these measures that Moïse was taking against Boulos and Vorb? We don't think so. We think the biggest fear was the fact that there was an uprising, some kind of revolution brewing in Haiti's vast shanty towns. Over the past 30 years, 40 years, Haiti's agriculture economy has been decimated, eviscerated by the United States and its neoliberal policies. And as a result, this is in the form of dumping of rice, destroying Haitian rice production, etc. So the cities have swelled. Port-au-Prince in the 1980s, when Jean-Claude left, was about 500,000 people. Today, it is about 3 million people. And as a result, you have this giant lumpen proletariat, which has been neglected. They are living in total squalor. And what we've seen is the, well, I'm going to deal with the question too, that we're coming back to that. But what the second question, which is who is in power now and what is their agenda? We've seen this movement of armed groups in these shanty towns grow. And they have become conscious, self-aware, and have said, we're not going to fight among each other anymore, as the bourgeoisie has been using us for years and years to carry out their wars and their struggles for political power. We are going to turn our weapons on the bourgeoisie and fight the bourgeoisie and bring down what they call this stinking rotten system. So who is in power now? We believe these are the people that this bourgeoisie they were threatened, they were scared to death. This imminent, this embryonic uprising, or I shouldn't say embryonic, it's begun, was an existential threat to them. And so I think this was really the reason why they had to move on that front. So the people they put in are two basically NED, National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA cut out, products. A guy called Ariel Henry, Dr. Ariel Henry, a neurosurgeon who acted as part of the Council of Sages in 2004. He was the guy who basically provided the legitimacy veneer for the de facto government of Gerard Latortue that came in after the 2004 coup against Aristide. And another guy called Claude Joseph, who was part of a student group who was also part of the NED campaign, financed campaign against Aristide. Ariel Henry is the prime minister. Claude Joseph, he was briefly prime minister for about 2 weeks, and then Ariel Henry came in. He's back in the post of foreign minister. Watch these two people; they're key. But their primary goal, and they are, I could say, the third musketeer, is a guy called Léon Charles. He's the chief of police, also a total Washington pawn. Léon Charles, very important in the 2004 coup in massacring in the shanty towns, and he's back in power. And the goal of these three guys is to destroy this so-called gang movement, the gangs. This is their whole focus. And so their agenda, their stated agenda, and we'll come to Daniel Foote, and maybe we can deal with that in the question and answer period, who was the US envoy who just resigned because of his indignation at what was being done to the Haitian refugees on the Texas border. The target, the principal target, is an alliance of what they call gangs, what we would call armed population. Marx and Lenin, Engels and Lenin had a different term for it. They called them autonomous armed groups, have emerged and formed an alliance called the G9. The formal name is the Revolutionary Forces of the G9, family and allies. Mess with one, you mess with all. And their goal is to overthrow the system. And a week before Jovenel's killing, they said, we are going to take over your grocery stores, your gas stations, your banks, and we are going to take what is ours. We need food. And their main demand, it's very simple, just like the Bolsheviks, land, peace, bread. Their main thing is, we need services. We need schools, hospitals, electricity, drinking water, internet. We need to have sanitation. People, are living in total hellscape, as the title of this is called. And you can see some of this in YouTube videos for anybody who even just wants to see them. Of the fellow who is the front man, or the leader, we could say, of this G9 alliance, a guy called Jimmy Cherizier, known as Barbecued. He got his name because his mother was the vendor of barbecued meats. There were 3 Jimmys in the neighborhood when he grew up. He grew up in a very poor neighborhood, and each Jimmy got the name of what his mother did. His mother did barbecue, so he became known as Jimmy Barbecue. He became a policeman. He went into the police. He's a kind of a natural leader. He excelled in the police, and he was in fact fighting gangs. He was fighting gangs. he got into, in 2017, he was part of a unit called the UDMO, the Departmental Unit for the Maintenance of Order. And they went into an operation out in Grand Ravine in the south of Port-au-Prince. The thing went bad. Some people were killed. So 2 cops were killed. In any case, he performed very valorously, heroically even. He was commended by the prime minister, etc. But the human rights groups got all over this. They were, in particular, 2 of them, again, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. These are basically CIA operations. And they started to say, oh, this whole thing was very bad, what happened there. And the cops leadership got worried and they said, we got to pin this somewhere. And they started to try to pin it on Cherizier. They summoned him. He said, I'm not going there. I see what you're doing. And he was already beginning to question things in the cops because he saw that there were 2 different justice systems, one for the poor, where he was from, and one for the rich. And so he started to rebel and drive first the gangs out of his neighborhood that were extorting merchants, raping women, kidnapping people, etc. And he said, we can't have this. And so he started to essentially do what they used to call vigilance brigades back in the 1986 period. He did vigilance brigades, and this spread, and he got other allies. But the bourgeoisie, and for a period, he even went over to the opposition leaders who were being run by guys like Reginald Boulos, a guy called Yuri La Tortue, and another guy called Andre Michel. And he saw that they were scoundrels too. These guys asked him to do unspeakable crimes. And he said, no way, I'm not part of you. And so he found himself both against Jovenel and against the opposition. But the opposition targeted him. And this is primarily through the US Embassy, which put Magnitsky sanctions on him and got their human rights groups to write report after report saying this guy is a devil, he's a monster, because they saw the danger of this burgeoning movement. And this is where I think the bourgeoisie panicked, above all Boulos and Vorbe, and they said, we got to get Jovenel out of the way because we got to deal with Cherizier and the G9. And at this point, the government is trying to focus on that, but they haven't been very successful. And the G9 is growing in strength, especially as Cherizier has spoken out more and more, calling for revolutionary change in Haiti. So with that, I think I'll stop because I know we went over a little bit and we have a lot of questions, I'm sure. So I will be standing by to answer any questions on those subjects that I talked about.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, this is Socialist Action's webinar, The Hell That Is Haiti, with Kim Ives and Marty Goodman. They have certainly described the horrific conditions and the history of US intervention racism towards the Haitian people. A while back, I learned that Haiti is #1 in the world in the production of baseballs.
Was number one
in the production of baseballs. And the workers in those US owned factories were paid something like 9 or 10 cents an hour.
Jeff, could I interject one thing there?
Sure.
Key thing is very important to understand about the Haitian people. They are fundamentally, it's in their DNA, anti-imperialist. The US came and they occupied both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, neighbors on the island of Hispaniola, what the Indians called Haiti, the whole island. The Dominicans adopted baseball, which the US Marines brought in to help pacify them. The Haitians never did. Haitians have never played baseball. They play soccer. And so baseball, even though they were a baseball producer primarily in the 1980s, they never accepted baseball, which was tried to be shoved down their throat by the US Marines. Just a little anecdote.
I appreciate that. My point was another point, though, and that is when Aristide was elected and he raised the minimum wage from 9 or 10 cents an hour to 12, that was considered a threat against U.S. corporations and it was part of the reason why they overthrew him. So welcome back, Marty. Apparently we lost you for
Yes.
and we'll go into a discussion period. Let me say that this webinar is brought to you by Socialist Action, and you can check us out, our YouTube included. Marty is pointing to his new book, The Hell That Is Haiti, magnificent summary of the history of US imperialism to this date. And you can check us out at socialistaction.org, check our other YouTubes. So in the meantime, let me ask this. Marty pointed out that the US imperialist policy towards Haiti has been bipartisan. He pointed out that that the current administration has deported more Haitians than the Trump administration. And before that, the Obama administration was #1 in the history of the United States in deportation. And now we have the spectacle of literally thousands of Haitians on the borders, starving, struggling to get into the United States. And the United States, in violation of every law, seeks to return to them to the hell that they created. How do you explain the fact that, well, first tell us a little bit about the nature of the opposition in the United States, the demands that they raise against the US government, and their solidarity with the Haitian people. How can the American US anti-war, anti-imperialist movement contribute to lessening the plight of the Haitian people? How can we organize ourselves to stop the deportations? Let's start with Marty Goodman and then go to you, Ken. But this time, let's keep our remarks down to a couple of minutes so we can have a bit of an exchange and hear from our audience. Marty?
Well, I lived in Miami in the early 80s when Father Gerard Jean-Just, leader of the Haitian Refugee Center and seen as a leader in the refugee community, launched a series of many demonstrations and mass mobilizations to defeat US policies in Haiti, to defeat the racist deportations. And through the efforts, as well as the legal staff, Ira Kurzban and Steve Forrester leading the way, and some others, they managed to defeat some of these policies that were inflicted on the Haitians. I could go in great detail about that, but I won't. But I think what we need to see is a restart in the Haitian community, a real struggle against imperialism, real struggle against racism. It's happened before in the Haitian community. In the early 90s, there was a huge mobilization of Haitians, had to be at least 100,000, that closed down Lower Manhattan over the bogus accusation that Haitians were spreading AIDS. We need to see those kind of mobilizations again, and we need to get organized. And I'm afraid the middle-class leadership of the Lavalas, the pro-Aristide movement, was really not up to sustaining the organization and mobilization that was necessary. They're too busy fighting amongst themselves and didn't really have the perspective needed to wage a fight to the finish. So what we would propose is organizing demonstrations out of the Haitian community with the support of solidarity people like myself, to relaunch a series of mass mobilizations to protest what's going on. And we stand on the shoulders of the Black Lives movement, which mobilized 20 million people in the street against racism. And we need to bring it to the attention of those masses, what we're up against here with the phenomenal racism of the Biden administration, who swore he would discontinue Trump's racist policies. The time is now to get into the street, and we've got to get organized. And here in New York, and in Miami, and Montreal, we've got to step up to the plate and get moving, because people are literally dying in Haiti, and we're sending Haitians back to that hellhole while Afghanis are welcomed in droves.
Hey, thank you.
From Cuba and all, everybody.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Kim.
Okay, well, let me just finish my point. We got to move on getting organized and build a coalition of anti-racist and anti-imperialist forces.
Thank you, Marty Goodman. Kim.
Yes, I think the mobilization around support in solidarity for the asylum seekers on the border, refugees coming in who are fleeing essentially the neo-colonial destruction of Haiti, because they've been fleeing not just recently, but really over the past 10 or 15 years. This group of 15,000 we see down in Del Rio, Texas. Many of them left Haiti in as early as 2005 and 6. 2010, many of them left after the earthquake. So yes, we need to show support and solidarity, especially the pictures of border agents on horses whipping them has helped with that. But I think the principal goal of the movement needs to be to stop US intervention in Haiti. We fear that inevitably, as there's a saying in Creole, a tiger can't change its stripes. And we know that the US Embassy has only one tool in its toolbox. That's a hammer to carry out interventions. And we fully expect, despite US protests, that they're not going to intervene in Haiti. We think that if we see the uprising in the shanty towns of Haiti continue at the level it's going, and if we continue to see the people resist along these lines, they will try. We know there have been initiatives from Black Alliance for Peace, Code Pink, Answer Coalition, other groups and coalitions which have thrown out the ideas of major mobilizations, and we totally support that. Haiti is right now struggling with multiple crises, not just after the earthquake and the storm, but the political crisis in the cities. So we really do need the solidarity and support of the anti-imperialist socialist movement in this country to make sure to stay the hand of US imperialism and keep them from sending yet this would be the 7th military deployment in Haiti if they send troops into Haiti.
Thank you so much, Kim. Our audience is probably a bit shocked at the horrors that both of you reveal today about the US imperialist history. 7 interventions, as Kim just said. But in truth, that history has been duplicated everywhere in Latin America. US backed the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua that killed 80,000. It backed the various death squad regimes in Guatemala that killed 400,000 people and maintained the pro-US death squad government. They did the same thing with the Batista government in Cuba, who murdered 80,000, and the Salvadorian death squad government that killed tens of thousands. And that is the role of imperialism has been consistent, intervening to establish governments that that the United States controls that allow for the exploitation of the people in that country and its resources. So the anti-imperialist movement, as both of you said, is decisive. That movement, in combination with the self-organization of the Haitian people, the Nicaraguans, the Venezuelans, and the Syrians, and everywhere else in the world, to challenge US intervention is critical. Our job in the United States is to keep the hands of the imperialist beast off the oppressed people of the world, to support their right of self-determination, even if we are critical of a particular leadership that is in power. It's not for us to decide the leadership, it's for the oppressed of the world to decide their own future, and that begins with the US imperialist hands-off. So with that, I'm going to call on Marty and Kim for final remarks. Let's try to keep it down for 5 minutes, and we'll go on from there. Again, check us out, socialistaction.org. Our YouTube presentations are online. Join us if you're interested, socialistaction.org. I'm Jeff Mackler, Socialist Action National Secretary. So with that, shall we go with Kim or Marty for closing remarks?
Marty, after you.
Okay, sure. I want to mention to everybody watching that I have an article in the current issue of Socialist Action about Haiti. And I think it covers a lot of bases and very accurately portrays US policy as unreservingly imperialist and racist for the last 200 years, actually. You want to get right down to it, and it hasn't changed its stripes one bit. We see the hate masses in the street in the hundreds of thousands, and yet Biden continues his support for the dictator Moise, and now the new stooges that are stepping forward, one of whom is very suspiciously connected with the assassination. We'll see what is revealed. Henri, who is the prime minister. We'll see what happens with that. But the Colombian death squads were involved, and you know, they're the US stooges in Colombia. And I went by a Colombian protest the other day, yesterday, and I talked to the Colombians about it. They said, yeah, we're in full solidarity with the Haitian people, and so on. So check out Socialist Action. We've had many articles on Haiti. This one has got a lot of articles from a couple of years ago and beyond. The typos are not extra, okay? But it's a good piece of, well, education about Haiti. We owe Haiti so much in this country. We owe them so much. They were the great liberators of Latin America. And the US racists freaked out at the Haitian Revolution. Haitian revolutionaries were actually sent into the Deep South to provoke conflict and struggle against the racist regime, believe it or not. So we need people in our group, Socialist Action, to help us build a solidarity movement with Haiti, build a democratic coalition that's principled and mobilizes in the street. We're in the belly of the beast. We are the most important factor outside of the Haitian working class themselves that will see a new Haiti. We say solidarity with Haiti. Long live the Haitian Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty Goodman. And Kim, you have the final words, and welcome again.
Okay, thank you again. And I think the most key thing for me to keep in mind is that the US empire has become extremely sophisticated in its coup making and regime manipulation and changing. By that, I mean, they don't just rely on right-wing forces, which are their natural ally. They do what they call triangulation. And we can see this particularly since 1983, when they spun off the National Endowment for Democracy out of the CIA. They have a part of the NED that is called the Solidarity Center. I'm sure many in Socialist Action are familiar with this, which is essentially a way to infiltrate the workers' movement, the progressive movement, under the guise of being worker representatives. And in many cases in Haiti, this is what's happening now. It's not just the bourgeoisie, which is fighting this G9 alliance, which has emerged. We see it on the left. We see the left has totally fallen under the sway, or parts of the left, or the so-called left, I should say, have fallen under the sway of the human rights groups that are in the pay of the NED line. And so they find themselves in the same position as the US Embassy, the human rights groups, and the Haitian bourgeoisie. You know, if you find yourself aligned with them, you really have to ask yourself a question: am I in the right analysis? So we ask those of you who may be listening, please don't accept the bleeding of the mainstream press, which writes article after article, hit job after hit job, vilifying the G9 movement, which, yes, is immature, is developing, is not perfect. It's not the Bolshevik Party. No, it is, though, trying to emerge. And to me, this is a genuine movement, which I think could end up, once again, thrusting Haiti into a vanguard role in Latin America.
Kim, thank you so much. Tell our audience how they can contact you, an email or a website, if they want to continue the conversation with you.
Well, Haiti Liberté can be found at Haiti Liberté, that's liberty with an E on the end, HaitiLiberté.com. You can see our articles there and get in touch with us. We appreciate that. We're mostly in French, but we do have an English section, of which I'm the editor, and a Creole section as well. And people can reach me at kim@HaitiLiberté.com.
Thank you so much. Marty, did you want?
Yeah, I just want to let people know that they could reach me in New York, Socialist Action, SPEWNYC at AOL.com, SPEWNYC at AOL.com. And please read the article this month on Haiti. We call for building a revolutionary party in Haiti, a working class party that will lead a revolution, a socialist revolution in Haiti that will finally end the US imposed misery there. Thank you, everyone.
I'll make a few final comments in regard to Kim's comment. It turns out that Haiti is #1 in the world per capita in the number of NGOs that function in that country. These are corporate-funded do-gooder organizations that are there to back the US line for the most part. They permeate Haitian society as they permeate the United States. It is no coincidence that the 26 million people that mobilized for Black Lives Matter against the racist murder of George Floyd ended up in the Biden campaign. Black Lives Matter movement, basically through its NGOs and corporate-funded organizations, was able to channel that massive discontent back into the politics of capitalist exploitations. So I think we're well aware of the fact that Haitian NGOs function in the same way. I'd like to express my profound thanks to Kim Ives from Haiti Liberté, a lifelong activist in solidarity with the freedom of the Haitian people, and to Marty Goodman, similarly a lifelong activist in defense of the Haitian people. And both of you, thanks for your longstanding fight against US imperialist intervention. And with that, we'll close. Check us out, socialistaction.org.
Thank you, Jeff.